In World War II, nations rose and fell in the struggle against Nazi Germany. Britain held the skies. America brought the industry, but far from Europe, one nation young, underestimated, and thousands of miles from the front struck decisive blows against the German war machine. They weren't supposed to win. They weren't even supposed to be there for long. And yet, they broke Germany's plans not once, but twice. This is the story of how Australian soldiers cut off, outnumbered, and often forgotten, outwitted, outlasted, and outfought some of Hitler's finest. From the burning sands of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific, this is the untold story of how Australia broke Germany's grip on the war. Twice. The first clash. Bardia, 1941. The year was 1941. The war in Europe had turned grim. France had fallen, Britain stood alone, and the Axis powers seemed unstoppable. But on the edge of North Africa, in a dusty Libyan fortress named Bardia, the tide was about to shift. The British Empire had chosen this barren coastline as the place to strike back at Mussolini's Italian army. And leading the charge were the Australians. The 6th Australian Division, fresh from training, had never seen real combat. Many of them were farmers, mechanics, clerks, and miners just months earlier. Now they faced 40,000 entrenched Italian soldiers behind minefields, barbed wire, and artillery positions. The odds were staggering, but the Australians were confident. Before dawn on January 3rd, 1941, the Australians advanced in silence. The wind howled across the desert, masking the sounds of men crawling through the sand, cutting wire with bare hands, and clearing mines under the cover of darkness. At 5:30 a.m., the attack began. Artillery thundered, and the desert erupted in fire. Australian infantry surged forward, smashing into bunkers with grenades, bayonets, and sheer determination. Their tanks roared through breaches in the wire, sending Italian defenders into chaos. By midday, the Australians had captured key positions that Italian commanders thought impenetrable. By nightfall, Bardia had fallen. 40,000 Italians surrendered, and the Australian flag rose above the fortress walls. It was the first Allied victory on land in World War II, and it had been achieved not by Britain or America, but by Australians. News of the victory spread across the world. In London, Churchill praised them as the pride of the empire. But in Berlin, Hitler was furious. The loss at Bardia shattered Axis morale. Italy's African front was collapsing, and Germany would now have to intervene. They would send their best, a man named Erwin Rommel. The Desert Fox was coming, and he was about to meet the one enemy he couldn't break. When Rommel arrived in Africa in early 1941, the desert was silent, a battlefield waiting to awaken. He brought with him the Afrika Korps, Germany's elite mechanized army. Tanks, artillery, and air support in perfect coordination. Wherever Rommel went, victory seemed to follow. Within weeks, he had recaptured much of what the British had gained. His forces advanced so fast that Allied commanders barely had time to react. But one stronghold stood in his way, Tobruk, a small coastal port, just 80 kilometers from the Egyptian border. To Rommel, Tobruk was everything. If he could take it, he could control supply lines and open the road to Egypt, and from there, the Middle East. When he launched his attack, he expected a quick victory. But inside Tobruk were the 9th Australian Division, along with British and Indian support units. They were ordered to hold as long as possible. No one expected them to last more than a few weeks. Rommel unleashed wave after wave of assaults. Tanks rolled forward, supported by Luftwaffe dive bombers screaming through the sky. The desert shook with every explosion. But the Australians didn't break. They manned their guns through the bombardment, waited until the German tanks closed in, and then in perfect timing opened fire. Anti-tank shells ripped through Rommel's armored spearheads. Infantrymen fought from dugouts carved into stone, sniping and ambushing with deadly precision. Each attack was repelled, and each counterattack left the Germans more frustrated. Rommel realized, to his shock, that this small garrison wasn't crumbling. It was bleeding him dry. The Desert Fox had found his match in a fortress manned by Australians. The Fortress of Tobruk. The siege began in April 1941. For the next 242 days, Tobruk became the most brutal battleground in North Africa. The Australians called themselves the Rats of Tobruk, a name given to them mockingly by Nazi propaganda, but proudly embraced as a symbol of endurance. Conditions were hellish. The sun scorched the ground by day, the cold bit hard by night. Flies swarmed over food and open wounds. Water was rationed, sometimes to just a pint per day. Dust clung to everything: uniforms, weapons, lungs. The men lived underground, in holes carved from limestone. They named their shelters things like the Ritz or the Palace, a dark joke in a place where luxury meant a full canteen of water. Despite the misery, morale remained high. The men shared jokes, songs, and letters from home. They mocked German propaganda broadcasts that promised their destruction. When the enemy's announcer sneered, "You are the rats of Tobruk, trapped and doomed," the Australians laughed and painted rat emblems on their helmets. At night, they raided German positions, small, fast, and ruthless. They crawled through the wire, struck supply dumps, ambushed patrols, and vanished back into the darkness. The Germans, unnerved, began to fear the night. Even Rommel's own reports grew frustrated. He called Tobruk a thorn in my side. His men called it the grave of the Afrika Korps. For every attack, the cost mounted. For every advance, the Australians countered with something even more stubborn. And slowly, the momentum shifted. Rommel had been stopped, breaking the Fox. By November 1941, the siege had dragged on for 7 grueling months. Rommel's once unstoppable army was exhausted, its supply lines stretched thin, and its morale was sinking. The Australians had not only survived, they had forced the Desert Fox into a stalemate. When the British launched Operation Crusader, a massive counteroffensive designed to relieve Tobruk, Rommel's forces were caught between 2 fronts. Inside the fortress, the Australians launched daring assaults to support the advance. Outside, British armored divisions cut deep into German lines. After weeks of brutal fighting, Rommel was forced to retreat, the first major German withdrawal of the North African campaign. The Desert Fox had been broken, his aura of invincibility shattered. Tobruk had cost Germany thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and months of precious time, and that time was everything. Because while Rommel struggled in the desert, Hitler's focus shifted to the Soviet Union, diverting attention and resources that might have crushed the Middle East. In holding Tobruk, the Australians had not just defended a fortress, they had altered the entire course of the war in Africa. For the first time, the Germans had been stopped, and it was the Australians who did it. The war comes home. By early 1942, the world had undergone significant changes. The Nazi threat still loomed in Europe and North Africa, but now, a new and terrifying front had opened. Japan had entered the war. Within months, their armies swept across the Pacific, from Singapore to the Philippines, from the Dutch East Indies to New Guinea, and soon their aircraft were overhead, attacking Australia itself. On February 19th, 1942, Japanese bombers struck Darwin. It was the largest attack ever mounted against Australia. Ships burned in the harbor, oil fires blackened the sky, and for the first time, Australians realized the war was no longer distant. It was home. In Sydney, submarine alarms echoed through the harbor as Japanese midget subs slipped into the bay. Searchlights swept across the water. Gun batteries fired into the dark. The unthinkable was happening. Meanwhile, many of the soldiers who had faced Rommel, the 9th Australian Division, they were still fighting in the Middle East. Their letters home spoke of worry for their families and fury that the enemy was now on their shores. When orders came to return to defend Australia and the Pacific, they didn't hesitate. But before heading home, the 9th Division left behind a legacy. They had not only held Tobruk, they had written the book on desert warfare. Their methods, rapid entrenchment, counter-ambush, flexible defense, became Allied doctrine. And their reputation? Even the Germans, in captured reports, described the Australians as aggressive, unpredictable, and relentless in attack. These weren't just soldiers anymore. They were professionals forged in fire, battle-hardened veterans whose names were whispered with respect even among their enemies. When they finally sailed back across the Indian Ocean, they weren't the same men who'd left. They had seen the desert, fought the Fox, and helped break one of Hitler's finest campaigns. And soon, they would bring that same defiance, that same endurance to a new enemy in the jungles of the Pacific. But before that chapter began, the war in Africa would need to end. And once again, the Australians would play their part. The desert's final lesson. The year was 1942. North Africa had become a graveyard of armies. After the siege of Tobruk, Rommel, the famed Desert Fox, was still determined to seize Egypt and the Suez Canal. The British and Commonwealth forces were battered, but not broken, and among them stood the men who had defied him once before, the Australians. Rommel's offensive surged eastward, driving deep into Egypt. The Allies fell back again and again, until they made their stand at a small railway station called El Alamein. It was here, in the barren sands west of Cairo, that the fate of the Middle East and perhaps the entire war would be decided. The 9th Australian Division, led by Major General Leslie Morshead, was called forward once more. They had already endured Tobruk. They knew Rommel's tricks, his feints, his thrusts, his deadly use of speed. However, the Australians were no longer defending a fortress. They were spearheading an assault. For 12 nights, they fought through barbed wire, mines, and machine gun nests. They advanced in darkness, guided by the stars, and marked their progress by the burning wrecks of German tanks. When Rommel counterattacked, the Australians held firm, repelling his panzer divisions again and again, forcing him to commit his reserves. Each time they drew him deeper into a trap. Then, in October 1942, General Montgomery unleashed the full weight of the Allied offensive. Operation Lightfoot, a massive, coordinated strike to crush the Afrika Korps once and for all. The Australians, on the northern flank, bore the heaviest fighting. They captured key ridges Tel El Asa Ridge, and Thompson's Post, each name now etched into history. Rommel's men fought like cornered wolves, but the Australians fought like veterans who knew exactly what it would take to win. And when the breakthrough came, it was the Australians who held the line, who cut the German retreat routes, and who helped break Rommel's army for good. The Desert Fox fled westward, his Afrika Korps shattered, his legend undone. Hitler's once proud commander beaten not by numbers, but by determination, endurance, and tactical brilliance. Once again, it was the Australians who had played the decisive role. The first time at Tobruk, they stopped him. The second time at El Alamein, they broke him. And this time, Rommel would never recover. The legacy. When the war in North Africa ended in 1943, the desert fell silent. The smoking remains of tanks, trucks, and aircraft were all that was left of Rommel's grand campaign. The Australians packed up their gear, many of them leaving behind comrades buried in foreign sand, and turned their eyes eastward, toward home. But what they left behind was something history would never forget. Their defense of Tobruk had been the first Allied victory on land in the war. Their stand at El Alamein had been a turning point. The battle marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. They were the underdogs of the empire, a nation of barely 7 million people standing shoulder to shoulder with giants. Yet time and again they proved themselves every bit the equal of the finest armies on earth. Captured German documents, later examined after the war, described the Australians in one line that said it all. The enemy shows no fear of death. Their courage inspired a generation. Their endurance became legend. And their victories at Bardia, Tobruk, and El Alamein echo through history as moments when Australia didn't just fight the war, it changed it. They broke Germany's advance not once, but twice, first in defiance, then in triumph. And though many never returned home, their spirit did. It lived on in every soldier who followed, in every memorial that stands today beneath the southern sky. They were called rats, but history remembers them as lions, the men who broke the Desert Fox and helped turn the tide of World War II. They were called the Rats of Tobruk, the sons of a faraway land who held back the storm. Against all odds, they proved that courage can outfight fear, and that even a small nation can change the course of history.